Let me ask you something. If they lift these quarantines, how many of you are going to take your children and go to the movies? How many of you are going to go out for a nice dinner at some restaurant? A lot of people are going to say, not yet, not yet. And how will you know that the people sitting next to you don't have that COVID-19? Maybe they don't show outward symptoms, but they're carriers. How will you know those things? I mean, this is going to be serious. And the question is, what kind of testing is needed to guarantee the safety of the people? Well, we have now neurologist and best-selling author, Dr. David Perlmutter. He's here to talk about that and other concerns ahead. And doctor, once again, we welcome you. Let me ask you that question. If we open up, how will people know that the folks sitting next to them in a restaurant or next to them in a theater or next to them at a concert are free of this COVID-19? How will we know about it?
Well, we're not going to know, and that's really what this comes down to. We know that it may be that as many as 50% of individuals infected and therefore infectious with respect to the COVID-19 virus may have no symptoms whatsoever. Think about that. When we are screening people, for example, who are going into a grocery store or coming off a plane by taking their temperature, we're at least missing 50% of people because they don't have symptoms. And I think the whole issue really comes down to the ability that we have to test people. That's really front and center in the entire conversation today about relaxing the quarantine and allowing people to get back to work, which is really important. But, you know, there seems to be this great divide. Do we keep people in lockdown or do we open up the economy and let things resume? And I don't think that these are necessarily mutually exclusive. We can do both, provided we can test people aggressively and determine who may be immune and therefore able to go back to work, or who may have just picked up the virus and therefore could transmit it. That would obviously be somebody who you wouldn't want to bring back to the meatpacking plant.
Well, what tests are available?
Basically, Pat, there are two types of tests available. We call them molecular and serological. The first is a test that actually looks for the genetics of the virus, telling you if you have that in your system right now. And that's the typical throat swab, nasal pharyngeal swab that you're seeing around the world. The next test that is becoming very popular is a measurement in your blood of the antibodies. In other words, has your body now mounted an immune response against COVID-19, and are you likely now immune and therefore not able to contract the virus again? Now, both of these kinds of tests are not 100%, and that is unfortunate. The latter, that tests the antibodies, we know can be what we call false positive, can indicate that you have antibodies, but these may be antibodies to other coronaviruses that we may have been exposed to years ago. I mean, the history of coronavirus dates back to the 1960s. That's when we first were able to identify it. So there are a lot of people going around who have antibodies to a coronavirus that may cross-react with many of these new tests and therefore give people a sense that they've been exposed this time around when they may not have been.
Well, Doctor, how do you scale this stuff? I mean, you're talking about a limited number of people who you can test, but I mean, we've got, 300 million people in America. How do we get tests to all of them?
And we need to scale it until it is scaled, to a much higher level. We're testing about 150,000 Americans each day. And Harvard research indicates that in order to be effective in terms of screening who has it and who doesn't, or who has immunity versus those who do not, we need to be doing 3 times that amount, or around 500,000 tests each day. In an ideal world, and I can only imagine this could happen with our scientists being able to figure this out, we should be able to embrace the idea that we could screen and test much like people do at-home blood sugar testing, people who are diabetic. If we could develop some kind of test along those lines, people could test frequently and know if they're negative and when they convert to being positive, and at that point would then be able to isolate themselves, let their people at their employment know that suddenly they've turned positive. Nobody wants anyone to go to work in any capacity who suddenly is carrying the virus. They stay home until they're better and then go back to work, hopefully having now become immune. That's the program that can satisfy both sides of this debate. You know, those who want to isolate us and those who want us to go back to work.
What about that experimental drug called remdesivir? Are you pleased with any of the tests of that?
Hard to say. The report that came out of Chicago several days ago actually wasn't a report. It was actually leaked information where the individuals involved in the testing were extremely positive in terms of what they had observed. So we're going to have to wait to see what the exact science looks like in terms of the metrics that they measured. We do feel, though, that remdesivir will likely be very, very important in terms of treating symptoms. Recognize this isn't an immunization, but this is a way of treating people who have moderate symptoms or who are hospitalized with severe symptoms as a way of shortening, for example, their hospital stay. Don't yet have all the information on that, but it looks very promising.
Doctor, one last question. You understand, or at least we understand, this virus may actually affect a person's brain. What are the implications of this?
Those implications are profound. And one study published several days ago in the New England Journal of Medicine noted that more than half of people admitted to the hospital have confusion. But I think what was more compelling was that about a third of the individuals discharged from the hospital have residual neurologic issues. For example, problems with what we call executive function, planning, purposeful activities, doing things, taking care of things, troubles with inattention. And so we don't know how much of those residual problems will be persistent in the long run. But if this infection leaves people with brain issues, with cognitive issues, it is a different story that we're going to have to be telling moving forward, and really raises our concern and clearly focuses on our efforts to move forward with ways of keeping people from getting this virus in the first place, i.e., trying to find some form of immunization and really being a lot more stringent in terms of isolating people who are carriers and could be transmitting this virus. So, you know, we now see that when we talk about who should be tested, that confusion has been added to the list of things like fever and a dry cough and pain in the chest. Now there are some neurological symptoms that would qualify somebody for being tested. So, you know, things are evolving with our understanding of how this virus presents itself.
Doctor, you're talking about something like Alzheimer's. Now, that becomes terrifying. It's one thing to have a fever and you get over a cough, but there's something else to have your brain. Is that going to be a permanent disability, you think?
Don't know the answer to that. I mean, to be sure, there has been a lot written in the past several years about the possible infectious causes, or what we call etiology, of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Rudolph Tanzi at Harvard has been really at the forefront of really exploring how viruses and other infectious agents, even some forms of bacteria like chlamydia, may be involved in creating a scenario that leads to Alzheimer's disease. The prospect that COVID-19 could leave people with some form of cognitive impairment is daunting in terms of what that might do globally to brain function, again, on a global basis platform. So we don't know yet. I would say this preliminary study involved very few individuals, 40 individuals. That's not a large number as we look at medical research, but nonetheless published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is arguably one of the most respected medical journals on the planet. And they raise this question that we need to follow people who have recovered after hospitalization very closely and get some sense as to what their residual brain compromise might be. But having said that, if in fact that turns out to be reality, it really causes us to think about how we should step up our efforts to prevent this in the first place. In other words, look at what you and I have talked about over the past several weeks, ideas of, for example, giving the plasma of somebody who has recovered to a person, even as a preventive, to keep them from even contracting this virus in the first place.
Well, Doctor, thank you for your brilliant analysis. And ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Perlmutter's book is called Brainwash, Detox Your Mind, Clear Thinking. He's got one called Grain Brain. You really need to get these books for yourself. They're available wherever books are sold, and Dr. Perlmutter is a very honored guest on this program. I think his insightful analysis of what's going on is as good as anything on television.